In the small town of Churchbay, where everyone knew each other, life flowed calmly and peacefully. The town was surrounded by dense forests and green hills, and its residents valued the quiet and tranquility. Churchbay had only a few shops, cafes, and one small library where you could find books to suit any taste. In this cozy place lived the Stratton family: Nancy, 35, and Ronnie, 40. They had been together for 15 years and lived those years in love and harmony. Their home was filled with warmth and comfort, with photographs on the walls capturing the happy moments of their lives. Nancy worked as a teacher at the local school, and Ronnie was a successful engineer at a small company. They both loved their jobs, but most of all, they dreamed of starting a family. For the past 10 years, they had been trying to have a child, but nothing worked. This caused them pain and disappointment. Nancy and Ronnie visited many doctors, underwent countless examinations and procedures, but all were unsuccessful. They tried to remain optimistic, but with each new disappointment, their hope faded. Nancy often sat in her room, looking at the empty baby crib they had bought in the hope of soon having a child. She imagined tucking her little one into bed, reading them fairy tales and singing lullabies. But the crib remained empty, and this caused her unbearable pain. Ronnie, seeing his wife suffering, tried to support her as best he could. He often brought her flowers, arranged romantic dinners, and tried to distract her from sad thoughts. But deep down, he also felt despair. He dreamed of teaching his child to play football, going fishing with them, and sharing his knowledge and experience. They tried various methods and treatments, including IVF, but all attempts ended in failure. Every time the pregnancy test showed a negative result, Nancy locked herself in the bathroom and cried quietly so Ronnie wouldn't see her tears. But he still felt her pain and helplessness. One day, after another failed test, Nancy and Ronnie sat in the kitchen, holding hands and silently looking at each other. The air was filled with tension and sadness. Nancy quietly said, "Ronnie, maybe this is a sign that we are not meant to have children?" Ronnie squeezed her hand and replied, "Nancy, we should not lose hope. We have been through so much together, and I believe that someday our dream will come true. We must keep trying." Nancy nodded, but there was sadness in her eyes. She knew Ronnie was right, but each new day brought new doubts and fears. They continued to hope, but their hope became more fragile with each disappointment. One day, a new neighbor, Anthony Clark, 30, entered their lives. He was young and energetic, with a broad smile and kind heart. Anthony moved to Churchbay from a big city to start a new life and find inspiration for his writing career. He quickly became part of the community, and his friendliness and sociability made him popular among the neighbors. Anthony was not only a talented writer but also a great conversationalist. He always found time to talk to someone from the neighborhood, help with small tasks, or just share a smile. His home was always open to guests, and he often hosted small parties and barbecues to get to know his new neighbors better. The Stratton family quickly befriended Anthony. They often had joint picnics, dinners, and barbecues. Nancy and Ronnie were glad to have a new friend who brought freshness and joy into their lives. Anthony, in turn, was grateful for the warm welcome and support. He often visited them, bringing fresh ideas and interesting stories from his life in the big city. One evening, after another barbecue, Nancy and Anthony were left alone. They sat on the terrace, enjoying the silence and the starry sky. Nancy told Anthony about her struggles and fears related to her inability to have a child. She talked about how she and Ronnie had been trying to have a child for 10 years, how they had gone through countless examinations and procedures, but all were unsuccessful. Nancy confessed that every time the pregnancy test showed a negative result, she felt broken and helpless. Anthony listened to her with sympathy and support. He saw how Nancy was struggling with her inner pain and wanted to help her. He told her about his experiences in the big city, about how he too had faced difficulties and disappointments, but always found the strength to move forward. Anthony shared his dreams and hopes, and Nancy felt that he understood her like no one else. "Nancy, I know it's hard," said Anthony, placing his hand on her shoulder, "but you should not lose hope. Sometimes life throws challenges at us to make us stronger." Nancy looked at him with gratitude. At that moment, a special connection formed between them, which over time grew into something more. They began to meet secretly, finding secluded corners where they could be together. Their relationship was full of passion and romance. They met by the riverbank and even in Anthony's house when Ronnie was at work. Nancy felt alive and happy for the first time in a long time, but she also felt guilty towards her husband. Ronnie began to notice changes in Nancy's behavior. She became more withdrawn and distant. He tried to talk to her, but she evaded conversations, citing fatigue and stress. Ronnie felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what it was. "Nancy, what's going on with you?" Ronnie asked one evening as they sat down for dinner. "You've been distant lately." Nancy looked up from her plate and smiled weakly. "Just tired, Ronnie. Work, home. Everything is piling up on me," she replied, trying to hide her nervousness. Ronnie frowned, sensing that she was hiding something. "Are you sure that's all? Maybe you need to rest?" Nancy nodded, but there was worry in her eyes. One day, Nancy realized she was pregnant. She was in shock and didn't know what to do. She hid her pregnancy from Ronnie, fearing his reaction. But over time, it became increasingly difficult to hide the truth. Nancy felt trapped, torn between the joy of pregnancy and the fear of exposure. How could this happen? She whispered to herself, looking at the positive pregnancy test. "What am I going to do now?" Her heart was racing, and she felt cold sweat running down her back. Nancy knew she had to tell Ronnie, but she was afraid of his reaction. She decided to tell him that she was pregnant from him, hoping he would believe her. "Ronnie, I have some news," she said one evening as they sat on the couch. "I'm pregnant." Ronnie looked at her with surprise and joy. "Really? That's wonderful," he exclaimed, hugging her. But his joy quickly turned to suspicion. He had long suspected Nancy's affair with Anthony and decided to do a DNA test to confirm his suspicions. Nancy was against it, and Ronnie insisted. "Nancy, I need to be sure that this is our child," he said, looking her in the eyes. "I know you have a relationship with Anthony. I saw how you look at him, how you change when he's around." Nancy felt her heart tighten with fear, but anger began to boil inside her. "Ronnie, how dare you accuse me of such a thing?" she cried out, her voice trembling with rage. "I love you, and this is our child. Don't you trust me?" Ronnie sighed, his face filled with determination and pain. "Nancy, I need to know the truth. I can't live in ignorance," he replied, his voice firm. "I saw how you changed. You became distant, withdrawn. I feel that something is wrong." Nancy jumped up from the couch, her eyes burning with anger. "You're just paranoid," she shouted. "You can't accept that we finally managed to have a child. You always look for problems where there are none." Ronnie shook his head, his face unreadable. "Nancy, I can't live with these doubts. I need to be sure that this is our child. I can't allow myself to doubt it." Nancy clenched her fists, her voice cold and accusatory. "I won't agree to this test, Ronnie. You're destroying our family with your suspicions. You don't trust me, and that hurts. I can't live with you if you continue to behave this way." Ronnie sighed, his eyes filled with pain and determination. "Nancy, I love you, but I need to know the truth. This is not just for me, but also for our future child. I can't live in ignorance." Nancy turned away, her shoulders shaking with anger and despair, hoping to break off this dialogue. She went outside, and Ronnie realized that his suspicions were not unfounded. Ronnie turned to their family doctor, Dr. Michelson. He went to his office one morning when there were few patients in the clinic. Dr. Michelson, a tall man with gray hair and glasses in a thin frame, smiled warmly at Ronnie. "Ronnie, nice to see you. What brings you to me?" the doctor asked, inviting him to sit down. Ronnie sat down and nervously clasped his hands. He knew his request would be unusual, but he was ready to do anything to find out the truth. "Doctor, I have a request. It concerns Nancy." Ronnie began, trying to speak calmly. Dr. Michelson frowned, sensing that the conversation would be serious. "I'm listening, Ronnie. What happened?" "Nancy is pregnant, and I want to make sure the child is mine. I suspect she has a relationship with our neighbor, Anthony, Ronnie confessed, looking the doctor in the eyes. Dr. Michelson sighed and took off his glasses, placing them on the table. Ronnie, this is a serious accusation. Are you sure you want to do a DNA test? Yes, I'm sure. I need to know the truth, Ronnie replied, taking an envelope with money from his pocket. I'm willing to pay for your help. Dr. Michelson looked at the envelope, then at Ronnie. He knew this was a violation of his professional ethics, but he also understood that Ronnie desperately needed answers. All right, Ronnie, I'll try to help you, but this must remain between us, the doctor said, taking the envelope and hiding it in a drawer. Ronnie nodded, feeling relief and fear at the same time. Thank you, doctor. I appreciate your help. Dr. Michelson scheduled a visit for Nancy to give blood samples, supposedly to check her overall health. Nancy came to the clinic, unaware of the true purpose of the visit. Dr. Michelson took her blood and sent the samples for analysis, including a DNA test. A few days later, Ronnie received the test results. He sat in his office, holding the envelope with the results in his hands. His heart was racing, and he felt cold sweat running down his back. He slowly opened the envelope and read the results. His worst fears were confirmed. The child was not his. Ronnie was furious. He didn't tell Nancy about the results, but his anger and resentment grew with each passing day. He decided he had to do something to avenge the betrayal. One day, Ronnie told Nancy that he was going on a motorcycle trip with friends. Ronnie carefully prepared for his departure. He packed a small bag with essentials, including clothes, money, and documents. He also took a pistol that he kept in a safe in case he needed protection. Before leaving, he hugged Nancy and kissed her on the forehead, trying not to show his nervousness. Be careful, Ronnie, Nancy said, unaware of his true intentions. Of course, dear. I'll be back in a couple of days, he replied, trying to speak calmly. Ronnie got on his motorcycle and drove to a motel on the outskirts of town. In the room, he sat on the bed and waited for the evening, his thoughts occupied with the upcoming events. When it got dark, Ronnie returned to Churchbay and parked his motorcycle on a neighboring street to avoid attention. He quietly approached his house and hid behind the trees, watching the entrance. His heart was racing, and he felt adrenaline coursing through his body. Ronnie noticed Anthony approaching their house and ringing the doorbell. Nancy opened the door and invited him inside. Ronnie approached the window and saw Anthony sitting on the couch, while Nancy knelt before him, moving her head up and down. The scene was so intimate and explicit that Ronnie felt his heart breaking with pain and rage. How could you? He whispered, his eyes filled with tears of anger. I trusted you, Nancy. I loved you. Ronnie went into a rage. He went to the garage, took a sledgehammer, and quietly entered the house through the back door. His steps were quiet and determined. His eyes were filled with rage, and he gripped the sledgehammer so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Anthony, unaware of the impending danger, continued to sit on the couch, enjoying the moment. Nancy, kneeling before him, continued to move her head up and down, completely absorbed in her betrayal. Ronnie approached closer, his heart pounding so loudly that he could hear it in his ears. He raised the sledgehammer over his head and, without giving Anthony a chance to defend himself, struck a powerful blow. The sound of the impact was deafening, and blood splattered in all directions, staining the walls and furniture. Anthony collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing in agony, his eyes filled with horror and disbelief. Nancy, in horror and with drops of blood on her face, begged her husband to forgive her. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she trembled all over. Ronnie, please forgive me, she sobbed, trying to stand up. Anthony raped me, but I was afraid to admit it. But Ronnie didn't believe her. His face was contorted with anger and hatred. He looked at her with such rage that Nancy felt her heart tighten with fear. You're lying, Nancy, he growled, his voice filled with contempt. I saw how you looked at him, how happy you were with him. You betrayed me, and now you will pay for it. Nancy tried to crawl away, but Ronnie grabbed her arm and pulled her to him. She screamed and begged, but he was relentless. He raised the sledgehammer over his head and struck 2 blows to her legs. Nancy was literally torn apart by pain and suffering, crawling on the floor and trying to reach the exit door, but Ronnie had already locked it and broken the door handle. "Ronnie, please don't do this," she pleaded, her voice filled with despair and horror. "I love you, Ronnie. Please forgive me." But Ronnie was unyielding. He took the phone and went to the garage, leaving Nancy in agony and fear. Nancy, covered in blood and with horror in her eyes, begged her husband to forgive her, but he silently left. Nancy received a glimmer of hope and thought that the worst was over, but Ronnie returned from the garage with a can of gasoline. He began to pour gasoline around the house, methodically spreading it on the floor, walls, and furniture. His face was contorted with hatred and rage. He poured gasoline over Anthony's body, lying on the couch, and over the pleading Nancy, who tried to crawl into a corner. Ronnie was unyielding. He reached the back door, took out a lighter, and looking into Nancy's crying eyes, said, "Burn in hell, but I will get you even there." He threw the lighter on the floor, and their house caught fire with the lovers inside. Ronnie stood opposite and watched as the house burned. Neighbors called the police and firefighters, but by that time, Ronnie had already disappeared. The police immediately began an investigation after finding 2 bodies in the house. At first, they thought it was a husband and wife, but while conducting the examination, the police received a call from that same motel where Ronnie was renting a room. From the motel, they reported finding a body in the room. Upon arriving at the scene, the police found Ronnie's body lying on the bed. His hands were folded on his chest, and a pistol lay nearby. The wall behind was covered in blood, and on the table lay a note with the words, "I am going to them in hell." The police inspected the room, noticing that all of Ronnie's belongings were neatly packed, as if he was preparing for a long journey. On the table lay his documents, motorcycle keys, and several photographs of the Stratton family. The police also found several empty whiskey bottles and an ashtray full of cigarette butts. The community was shocked by this news. The once quiet and peaceful town of Churchbay was plunged into horror and darkness. Residents could not believe that such a thing could happen in their small, cozy town, where everyone knew each other, and where there was always an atmosphere of trust and mutual assistance. The news of the Stratton family tragedy spread through the town like wildfire. People gathered on the streets, discussing what had happened with disbelief and fear. In their eyes, there was horror and incomprehension. How could this happen in their peaceful, friendly town? How could it be that neighbors they knew and respected were involved in such a tragedy? "Have you heard?" whispered Mrs. Johnson, the owner of the local store, to her friend, Mrs. Smith. "Ronnie Stratton killed his wife and Anthony Clark, burned his house with the bodies inside, and then committed suicide. It's just unbelievable." "Yes, I heard," replied Mrs. Smith, her voice trembling with fear. "I can't believe that something like this could happen here, in Churchbay. It's just horrible." The townspeople gathered for meetings to discuss safety measures and support each other during this difficult time. Special services were held in the church, where people prayed for the souls of the deceased and sought comfort. "We must be strong and support each other," said the pastor at one of these services. "What happened has shown us how fragile and unpredictable human life can be. But we must believe that light always triumphs over darkness."